Grammar subject knowledge, verbs and verb phrases.
In this video, I'm hoping to help you become a little bit more confident with some of your grammatical subject knowledge.
Grammatical subject knowledge, verbs and verb phrases. Professor Deborah Myhill, Professor of Education, University of Exeter. Director of the Centre for Research in Writing.
It might seem strange to spend all my time just talking about verbs and verb phrases, but one of the things about grammar is that you learn it incrementally and in layers, and it's very difficult to do too much all at once. I've deliberately chosen verbs and verb phrases because we see that a lot of teachers have some problems with this, and we see that children too then pick up some errors. If you do understand what verbs and verb phrases are, it lays the foundation for all kinds of other grammar learning to layer on. Although this is really targeting your subject knowledge, throughout the presentation I will refer to problems that children have where relevant, because there's such a strong connection between your own grammatical knowledge and what children learn. So let's press on and look more closely at the verb. And as I mentioned before, the verb is really a powerful thing to know grammatically because it's at the heart of every sentence. I mean, a formal, regular sentence can't exist without the verb. And as that example stop showed you, it can exist with only the verb. But also the verb is crucial to that notion of building clauses and other structures. So it's really crucial to know it. And yet, it's quite hard to teach.
The problem of the doing word.
So one major problem that we see repeatedly in schools is children being taught that a verb is a doing word. Now, the irony of this is that if you asked most people cold, what's the doing word in this sentence? What's the verb in this sentence? Most of them would pick doing, which is actually an adjective, an example of word class mobility again. It's just that doing seems to be the most active word in this sentence. So it's an irony that it's used as a way to explain. The problem is that actually many verbs that you find when you look at real text, at authentically text, aren't obviously doing words at all. For example, the two most frequent verbs in most texts in English are be and have, and they don't have much element of doingness in them at all. And then, of course, the other problem for children is that the word which seems to suggest action or doing in a sentence may not be the verb. So if you say, I love hunting, and think, well, a verb's a doing word, you're likely to pick hunting as the verb, where it's the noun. Back to that dogs one, I love dogs. It's a good way to test out those ing ones. Or I saw the dream catcher. Seeing doesn't seem terribly active, whereas dream catcher, even though it's a noun, does sound like the word that embodies most of the doing. So one thing to do is really to avoid telling children that a verb is a doing word. Teachers do it because, as I was saying earlier, the problem of definitions means there's no substitute definition that works particularly well. But I'm going to suggest to you how you might handle that.
The verb, a starting point. The verb be. Be, am, are, is, was, were, being, been. The verb have. Have, has, had, having.
So I would always start with the verb to be and the verb have, to have, way back in Key Stage 1, because if you can establish those verbs as verbs, you're creating really good building blocks later for verb phrases, which I'm going to talk about. They're very high frequency verbs in English. And unlike other words where we've talked about word class mobility already, these verbs are very rarely nouns or adjectives. You could say human being is the only example really of being an adjective, a noun. Other times these are always verbs, and you can simply teach them those words almost by heart. You know, what are the possibilities there are for the verb be? These are the only ones there are: be, am, are, is, was, were, being, been. And you don't have to tell them whether they're participles, present tenses or whatever. Just get them to learn those words. And then have, has, had, having. And you could play games like, you know, playing around with a children's story, an advert and a newspaper article, and counting the number of occurrences of the verb to be and to have, and seeing, you know, which text has got the most in them. So for yourself, Be really clear that you know that those be and have words are verbs, and always make sure that children are clear about that, because it's a foundational part of learning about verbs.
Lexical verbs, the doing verbs.
But then you might move on to how do you deal with this idea of the doing verb? The truth is, of course, that some verbs do express an action. And if I were teaching in Key Stage 1, after I'd taught the verb to be, I would move on to what you might call the classic doing verbs, but I'd call them action verbs, and I would say some verbs express an action, rather than a verb is a doing word or a verb is an action word. And they are the easiest to understand because of that. It's back to that abstractness. There's a slightly more concrete relationship between an action verb and the word, so they're usually easier to point out. So things like jump, dance, eat or ache. But actually there are actions as well which don't seem quite so obviously active. So things like organise, lead or survive. So you can see as the vocabulary becomes more sophisticated, the complexity of the action is more sophisticated. Then there are reporting verbs, which we often teach in relation to dialogue. Whisper, suggest, exclaim, shout, and that's quite a useful way to classify verbs. And also sensing verbs. They're the ones that actually don't have any sense of doingness with them because they feel very static. Believe, know, imagine, enjoy, fear, see, hear, like. And you could start to build classification banks on walls, for example, of action, reporting, sensing. And actually it's usually quite good to have an other category for ones that don't seem to fit everywhere, because as with a lot of things in grammar and in language, things aren't perfect in how they categorise. But if a new word comes up, you could say, do you think this is an action verb? Do you think this is a reporting verb? Is it a sensing verb? Or do you think it might be something else? So those classifications help with that idea of the doing verb. These are called lexical verbs. So the lexical verbs are the verbs that have a real semantic meaning, a real meaning. And we'd look them up. You know, if you didn't know what suggest meant, you'd look up suggest in the dictionary.
Where are the verbs? A passage on the screen.
So let's just look at this a little bit. Here's a information text from a book about kangaroos. You might want to just pause the video here and see if you can identify the verbs. There's a range of verbs there, but just have a look and see what you can do.
Kangaroos are only found in Australia and Papua New Guinea. They are a diverse family, with more than 60 different species, and live in a wide range of habitats, from wet rainforests through to dry plains. Kangaroos are marsupials. Their young are born undeveloped and then continue to grow in their mother's pouches. Their family name, macropod, means Bigfoot. The biggest of all macropods is the red kangaroo. They live in the hot, dry inland of Australia, where food can be scarce and water even more so. From Big Red Kangaroo by Claire Saxby. Illustrations by Graham Byrne.
So let's just look at this then and see where the verbs are. Now notice how many are verbs, to be verbs there are. Kangaroos are only found, they are a diverse family, they are marsupials, the young are born underdeveloped, the biggest is the red kangaroo, food can be scarce. But there are also some other verbs, found, live, continue, grow, so there's other information being provided there, and you could even stop and think about, well, how would you classify those other verbs, found, live, continue, grow, in terms of whether you think they're action verbs, reporting verbs, sensing verbs, or something else. And while you're looking at this, just to make that connection between the grammar and what it's doing, notice how the present tense here, all these verbs are present tense, and how prominent they are. And that's a characteristic of information text. It's often called the universal present tense because it creates a sense of generality, of universal truth.
Verb phrases.
So let's move from just the verb itself as a single word to verb phrases. This is where we found teachers have been most confused and often don't realise this notion that verbs are in verb phrases. And yet when we look at ordinary books, you can often see that these texts are packed with verb phrases.
playing with verbs.
So play around a bit with verbs. If you just take the verb waste, you might think about how many different versions of the verb can you produce, beginning with a pronoun. I've given just 5 examples here. I waste, and I finished them off so you can just see them as sort of complete sentences. I waste too much, you're wasting my time, he should have wasted less, they'd been wasting everybody's time, we were wasting too much time. And to do this, you can think about variation in tense, past or present. You could look at the variation about whether you've got forms which use the verbs be and have before the lexical verb. And you could look at variations which use could, should, will, etc. So again, just pause the video here and see if you can write down some other versions.
Once again, the phrases are, I waste too much, you are wasting my time, he should have wasted less, they had been wasting everybody's time, we were wasting too much time.
One thing to notice here is that everything that's underlined in the blue is a verb phrase, including when there's only one verb, confusingly. So I waste is a verb phrase. In school, I tend to say verb. I just think it's easier for children to think single word verb, more than one verb, verb phrase. So are wasting, should have wasted, had been wasting, were wasting are verb phrases. And you can tell that they're verb phrases because they are all different ways of expressing something about that key verb waste. They just slightly alter the time or the expression or how it's being expressed or the tense. And you can always see where the lexical verb is. The lexical verb here is waste. So it's there in all of them. So let's explore this a little more.
Verb phrase structure.
So here we are with some examples, rather like waste.
The verbs and verb phrases are set out in 2 matching columns. I dance, I am dancing. I danced, I was dancing. I had danced, I could have danced. I should have been dancing, I might be dancing.
But this time using the lexical verb dance and showing some of those possibilities for verb phrases. And I really do think that for you as teachers, knowing this difference between lexical, auxiliary and modal verbs is really important for you. I'm not sure it's so necessary for children, although if you've got children who are capable of understanding, it might help with discussions. But for you, it's a key way of looking at verb phrases. So here you can see the same patterns that you were looking at with waste. The longest a verb phrase can be is 5 words. And it's usually something like should have been being dancing, which doesn't entirely make sense in this example. But it can be no longer than that. And very commonly it's 2 or 3 words in the verb phrase. So to understand clauses, you have to understand that the verb, when you talk about the verb in a clause, is very often not one verb, but 3 verbs, as in I could have danced all night. That's one clause. It's also one sentence with one verb phrase.
The phrases are listed in a single column. I dance, I am dancing, I danced, I was dancing, I had danced, I could have danced, I might be dancing, I should have been dancing.
So let's look first at those lexical verbs. The lexical verb always comes last in the verb phrase. So you can see dance and the variations, the participles and the past tense and present tense of dance are last in the verb phrase. And that helps you to decide, is it a verb phrase or is it actually another verb forming a new clause, which can happen in more complicated sentences. So just notice that pattern, the lexical verb being last in the sentence, in the verb phrase.
The verbs picked out in the list are am, was, had, have, be, have been.
Then if you look at the auxiliary verb, which are here in purple, they always precede the lexical verb. So you can see that when there's only verbs to be or have, as in I am dancing, I was dancing, I had danced, it's immediately before the lexical verb. But where the modal verb comes in as well, it's still immediately before the lexical verb, but it's after the modal verb. So you can see there the structure of the auxiliary verbs building up that verb phrase. And in fact, one of the reasons why be and have are the most common verbs in many texts is more because of this being used to create noun phrases than being used lexically to mean to be or to have.
The verbs picked out in the list are could, might, should.
And then modal verbs. Modal verbs in some ways are a very easy group because there's only a small number of them. But the helpful thing with these is that they always come first in a verb phrase. I could have danced, I might be dancing, I should have been dancing. So you can see there how those three types of verb, the lexical verb, the auxiliary verb, and the modal verb are the ways in which verb phrases are constructed, and there is a regular pattern to them in terms of what comes where within the verb phrase. And I think that's well worth learning. So let's move now from verb phrases to past and present participles, because this is another area that often does cause confusion and actually is really important when you're trying to teach past progressive or present progressive and the various forms of aspect. So when you have a verb, you can either have a verb in the past or present tense, or you can have a verb with a past or present participle. And actually, it's quite easy to tell them apart once you realise the tricks of doing it. So in English, we only have these two tenses, past or present, and it's represented here as in I dance, present, and I danced, past. Straightforward, there's only one verb in the verb phrase, and this one is a regular past tense formed using ed, which of course lots of our verbs do, but also lots of verbs don't. Just think about I go and I went. But then when you move to a verb phrase that's got multiple verbs in it, as these other examples do.
There are 6 examples. I am dancing, I was dancing. I had danced, I could have danced. I might be dancing, I should have been dancing.
First of all, remember what you know about the lexical verb. The lexical verb is at the end of the verb phrase. And where there's more than one verb in a verb phrase, that lexical verb at the end is always either a present or past participle. So there's a really easy way there to remember the difference between is it a past or present tense or is it a past or present participle. If it's on its own and it's just one verb in the verb phrase, it's a tense. If it's at the end of a verb phrase with more than one verb in it, as in the 6 we've got here, then it's either a past or present participle. So you can begin to see that incremental layering of knowledge. First of all, understanding that verbs aren't doing words and realizing that there are a broader range of verbs, including to have and to be. Then understanding that structure of the verb phrase and recognizing that a verb phrase could have up to 5 words in it, but it will be built from the lexical verb at the end, the auxiliary verbs be and have, and then the modal verbs could, should, might, etc. The hardest one here that's really worth drawing out is danced, because this repeats itself throughout all regular verbs. You look at danced and it's the same form in the past tense or the past participle. So I danced and I had danced. So this is where remembering that guidance, that if it's on its own, as in I danced, it's past tense, but if it's in a verb phrase with something before it, as in I had danced or I could have danced, it's a past participle. Dancing, on the ing participle, the present participle, they're very easy because they are the words that end with ing in a verb phrase are always present participles, so they don't cause a problem. It's the fact that the ed ending can be both the past tense or the past participle, depending on whether it's a single verb or whether it's in a verb phrase. Of course, remember with dancing, as we did earlier with driving, it's always a present participle in a verb phrase, but it could be a noun. I am really working on my dancing, or it could be an adjective. Here are my dancing shoes. So you just have to remember that word class mobility too. So again, another little task for you to play around with here. Stop the video, read this extract from Sky Song by Abby Elphinstone, a lovely book for primary school children, and look at where are the verbs and verb phrases. There's lots in this one, and it shifts between a single verb and verb phrases. So stop the video, and when you're ready, move on.
A passage on the screen. A burst of sparks shot out, and the Erkenbear tumbled backwards, but it was up again in seconds. Flint worked harder with the knife until there was a click, and, as Whitefur launched himself at the Ice Queen, Esker pushed the wooden lid open. A swirl of colours twisted towards her, and as they fell about her face, it felt, to Esker, as if she was looking at a rainbow through the mist. But then the mist seemed to fade, and the colours became stronger, and finally Esker saw her past clearly. She was sledging on the Nevercliffs with her ma. Then she was hunting caribou on the driftlands with her pa. Next, she was making necklaces from river quartz with her parents. Then she was running, hand in hand with them, across the foothills to catch a glimpse of a golden eagle. This was her past, a lifetime out in the world with two people who loved her more than she could have hoped for.
So here we are. You can see there's quite a lot of single verbs as verb phrases: shot, worked, tumbled, saw, became. But there are also quite a few verb phrases. Was hunting, was making, was running, could have hoped for. And just to kind of, again, make that connection between what we're doing here, which is really just helping you to name and identify structures, it's really worth noticing what they're doing. You've got here a simple past tense, which is actually describing the actions of the narrative at this point in the story. But the past progressive, that was making, was hunting, was running, actually conveys earlier time. It's Esker remembering her own past. So you've got two layers of time in this story, conveyed through that simple past tense and through that past progressive aspect. So again, have another go, because practice is brilliant for grammar. Here's an extract from Roald Dahl's Witches. Stop the video again, look at this and work out where the verbs and phrases are, and then move the video on again.
A passage on the screen. We were in the big living room of her house in Oslo, and I was ready for bed. The curtains were never drawn in that house, and through the windows I could see huge snowflakes falling slowly onto an outside world that was as black as tar. My grandmother was tremendously old and wrinkled, with a massive wide body which was smothered in grey lace. She sat there majestic in her armchair, filling every inch of it. Not even a mouse could have squeezed in to sit beside her. I myself, just 7 years old, was crouched on the floor at her feet, wearing pyjamas, dressing gown and slippers.
So here we are. Quite a lot of verbs to be. We were, I was, my grandmother was, which was. So you can see there how important that verb to be is. But there's also some verb phrases here. Could see, could have squeezed, was crouched. And I just wanted to draw your attention to that one slightly tricky one. The curtains were never drawn in that house. The verb phrase there is actually were drawn, and never, like not, which is an adverb, believe it or not, because it's telling you more about the verb, can sometimes split a verb phrase in two. When the curtains were not drawn, the curtains were never drawn, the curtains were rarely drawn. So you just have to watch out if you've got an adverb in the middle, that you don't see it as two verbs, the verb were and the verb drawn. It's a single verb phrase.
What this overview of verbs has not addressed.
So I just want to start to pull this to the end a little bit by just thinking about what have we not had time to address here, although I've hinted at it. We haven't looked at perfect and progressive aspect. To do that, that understanding about the verb phrase and the understanding about past and present participles is crucial knowledge. So if you've got that sorted out, you can then move on and look at that sense of what aspect means, and I think you'll find it a lot easier. Then finite and non-finite verbs, which I won't talk about at all, but just so that you're aware that that's another structure, often very helpful when you're talking about clauses. The passive voice, I could do a whole session just on the passive voice and how we need to explain that. Infinitives, or bare forms as they're often called in English, because although we often say that the verb to be is an infinitive, actually in English it's be that's the infinitive. We create We put to in front of it to make it sound like an infinitive, but actually it's be that is the infinitive. And clauses. Again, I could do masses of work on clauses, and they are really, really important. But if you've really grasped what I've looked at today, what you really do have is a lot of those building blocks in place that will make that easier to do later. So don't worry about that for now, but come back to it.
Plenary.
So, to pull together what you've learnt today, just want to remind you that I've only focused on verbs, and I've only focused on some aspect of verbs because I'm really keen that you get this sense that grammatical understanding comes in layers rather than in one lump. And I've tried to demonstrate in the presentation the way that you can layer up from teaching about the verb to be right through to talking about past and present participles, and those things that I've indicated that we haven't touched on.
Teacher's subject knowledge.
But your subject knowledge is what this PowerPoint was fundamentally about. So even though I've talked about children's learning, what they learn comes from you, and what they misunderstand comes from you. So I've always said that actually it's much more important that you're strong at grammar than that children are, because you need to be able to cope with the kind of questions that they ask and things that they've misunderstood. And actually children's questions about grammar can be brilliantly perceptive, and often we've seen teachers then thrown by the question. So our research suggests that effective grammar knowledge includes not just your strong knowledge of grammar in terms of the labelling, but that you are really clear about phrase and syntax level as well as word class level, that you notice how grammatical choice is functioning in published text so you can make connections between the grammar and what it's doing, which is really the main point of teaching grammar, and that you've got that sense of being able to look at children's own writing and notice where they are in their grammatical development and what might be the natural developmental steps for them to make next in terms of their learning.
Teaching grammar. Principles.
And when you're teaching grammar, you can live by the same principles. Build learning incrementally for children. So do start with the simple and most obvious examples. So the idea that verbs are action words is a logical place to start. Just don't say all verbs are action words. Say some verbs are action words. Then you can layer in more complex understanding over time. And don't be afraid to make clear to learners that they're only learning part of something, that they're going to learn more later. Adverbs are a good example, just like action verbs. It does make sense to start with ly adverbs because they are simple to understand. But don't say adverbs end in ly. Say something like, there are lots of words which are adverbs, but we're going to start with adverbs that end with ly. So then later you can layer in more learning and they won't be saying to you, but you said adverbs end in ly. Particularly be careful about the definitions you give. I've talked about the verb being a doing word, but to call an adjective as a describing word is misleading because all lexical words describe. Monster is a describing word. Stumble as a verb is a describing word. The other thing, don't say a coordinating conjunction joins two simple sentences because it doesn't, or it does sometimes, but it does much more than that. It can just join two phrases or two nouns or two adjectives, but also in a sentence it can join three clauses. So don't give them half-truths, but just start with the simpler examples. Teach grammar using lots of real examples so that children can see visually the structures that you're teaching. Lots of playing around with interactive whiteboards, moving things around, or cards on tables. But you could consider colour coding consistently throughout the school so that you know that whenever you're showing verbs, you're going to show them in green, or whenever you're showing nouns, you're showing them in red, because that will reinforce those visual examples. And do try to use the grammar terminology naturally during all of your teaching of English, not just when you're focusing on the grammar itself, so that they hear you using the terminology.
Further resources. Eve Bairn and David Reedy. Teaching Grammar Effectively in Primary Schools. UKLA 2013. D. A. Myhill, S. M. Jones, A. Watson and H. E. Lines. Essential Primary Grammar. Open University Press 2016. Two website links are http:// www.englishus.com cybergrammar.org/. Englicious is spelt ENGLICIOUS, and cybergrammar http://www.cybergrammar.co.uk/.
And if you want some suggestions of further useful resources, there are some examples here. 2 books that are really useful. Eve Byrne and David Reedy's book about teaching grammar is brilliant. Our book, Essential Primary Grammar, is really a subject knowledge book, so it tries to explain all these things in detail with teachers in mind. There's a website called Englicious, which you can click on, which also helps with your subject knowledge, and also a website we designed, Cybergrammar, that again you can go in and self-test. So I hope that's built a little bit of confidence, but go away now and just for the rest of the day keep looking at verbs every time you see them anywhere and try and think about what do you know about what kind of verb it is. And I hope you'll be surprised at what you now know.
The end.